I sing a song of the saints of God, patient and brave and true, who toiled and fought and lived and died for the Lord they loved and knew. And one was a doctor, and one was a queen, and one was a shepherdess on the green. They were all of them saints of God, and I mean, God help me to be one too.
Hello and welcome to Tea Time Theology. My name is Ivy Swinsky, and our guest today is the Reverend Stacy Alan. She is the chaplain of Brent House, which is the Episcopal campus ministry at the University of Chicago. Thank you so much for joining us today, Stacy.
I am delighted to be here.
So this season, we're talking mostly about one character of the Bible in each episode. And my first question to you is, do you think character makes sense when talking about people in the Bible?
My first answer is yes. It almost feels like a trick question. Can you say more about why you're asking that question?
I think it's a very interesting idea because there are parts that like this actually happened. And like when we talk about history books, we don't talk about like the character of Henry VIII or something like that. But when we talk about the Bible, I feel like we do kind of use that language. And I think it also kind of brings in this idea of, is language important and how we quantify things important?
Right. No, I would say that character is just fine. You know, the question of whether or not we understand certain of the people presented in the stories in Scripture existed in history, whether or not we agree on that, those characters take on a meaning and a significance beyond who they may or may not have been in history. So unlike Henry VIII, someone like Job or David or Miriam, there is a meaning for those of us who hold Scripture as sacred that transcends but makes them more than, in quotes, just history. I'm going to be thinking about that question, though.
You can change halfway through. We can be in the middle and you'll be like, actually, I don't think he should be called a character. That's something we've been talking about even just when thinking about what we want to do this season is character even the right word? And I think specifically in the book of Job, which is what we're here to talk about today, I feel like language is so important in this book.
Yep.
And the language we choose to use. So I just wanted to know if, even just grounding ourselves in this idea of what are we even calling Job in the context of this book, in the context of the Bible as a whole, with the Old and New Testament, and is there a difference between characters that are in the Old Testament versus the New Testament as well?
Yeah, and I think it will also depend in the Hebrew Scriptures on what you're talking about, right? Mm-hmm. So Job almost certainly was not a historical person. The little bit that I know of the scholarship of the book, it was probably rooted in an old folk tale. The literary composition revealed, like, it's pretty clear that the framing story has one author and the middle part is someone else. So in this particular case, character is absolutely appropriate. I am intrigued, though, by the idea of thinking about someone like, again, David, who almost certainly, has historical roots.
Yeah.
What that means. But again, especially with David, because he takes on a significance both for Jews and Christians that transcend who he may or may not have been as a guerrilla fighter, as king, all of those things.
So we are talking about Job, and I will say the first time that I really experienced this book, or mention is really a better way of putting it, was I took a religion and ethics class in college. So encountering Job for one of the first times in the context of an ethics course is very interesting. I will throw that out first and foremost. But I just want to know, first of all, what are your initial reactions when you look at Job? Because even just on the page, which gets kind of boring, but I'm a nerd for that kind of stuff, it looks very much like the book of Psalms. Like when I was flipping through a Bible trying to find it, I accidentally fell into Psalms because it looks exactly the same. And do you think there's an importance even just how it looks on the page, the same way talking about what sort of language we use?
So I'm going to be absolutely honest here in a way that I'm not terribly proud of. The most of the time I spend with the Book of Job is what gets read in the lectionary. So the 3 or 4 Sundays every 3 years that we have those texts come up. It's the first part of the framing narrative. There might be something from the middle where it looks like the Psalms, and then the last 2 or 3 weeks are from the very end. So the last of the poetic part and the closing narrative. Because the rest of the book is a lot.
Yeah.
It's a lot, both in terms of quantity, and it's easy to get kind of lost and overwhelmed in all of the poetic language in there that just goes on and on and on and on. I mean, Job's friends don't stop talking. So, but I think there's a significance to that. There was something that the author was really trying to wrestle with that required all sorts, the length of the poetry and the extensive dialogue between him and his 3 friends and the weird newcomer who shows up toward the end. And I think I think you could probably argue that some of that is reflective of the thorniness of the fundamental question that the book poses. Why do bad things happen to good people? Where is God in the middle of all of that? And how are we to respond to our fellow humans who are suffering? And there are no easy answers to any of that. And so the complexity, I think, of the text, I think reflects the complexity of the question.
I think that makes a lot of sense. The question, I feel like, is too hard to be answered in a sort of basic way. And so putting it into this sort of like poetry dialogue, I think, is a very human way of trying to figure out and muddle through what is going on. So let's jump right into the main question that you posed as well, as what is the point of Job? And this idea of why do good things happen to bad people? Or switch that. Why do bad things happen to good people?
That's right. That's right. Well, it occurs to me with what we were just saying, the bulk of the text is not narrative. And I think one of the things that, we often don't want to talk about is the tedium of suffering, right? That it just sucks. and it doesn't seem to stop. And there's a kind of, I don't want to say boredom because suffering's not boring, but it can be tedious. Now, I'm not saying that the text is tedious. Some might, but I'm not saying that. So I think there is something even in that format that the short, clear parts are the narrative parts, where there's action. But the bulk of the book is the just being with it and trying to make sense of it. So I think there's something really significant about that fact that so much of the 40-odd chapters of the book are wrestling with this question with no plot development, right? Except for Eliphaz has, showing up right out of the blue, and we still with no context. So there are a couple things with the book that I think are really significant. I mean, clearly, the story is set up to say we have a good God who seems to be playing games with people's lives. The text does not shy away from that. The character of Satan, which in Hebrew simply means the adversary, that's not necessarily the devil as we understand it, is hanging out in God's throne room. I mean, this is it's like it's almost like two bros having a bet, right? About the the ants on the ground, which is certainly how it can feel when you're in the middle of suffering, right? So the book is kind of fearless in positing the question. And it is, I was thinking about this today, it also is very, very careful to say, no, really, this guy had done nothing wrong. And all of us actually have done something. But it was really important for the book to say, no, let's clear away any of those questions of deserved suffering or logical consequences and wrestle. The other thing in the book, and I just need to get this pet peeve of mine out of my system right up front. We have the phrase in English of talking about someone having the patience of Job, which is the most misleading phrase I think you could ever find. Because if you pay attention to Job in the book, he's not having it. He is not sanguine. He is not accepting of his fate. He's mad and he's confused. And he wants, there's all sorts of juridical language in here of wanting to bring God to trial because this is not right and someone has to be held accountable. And so this idea that somehow Job is a book that encourages a kind of acquiescence, a kind of patience and submission to something without complaint is the most misleading understanding of the book and sucks it of so much, I think, of its healing power if we don't allow Job to have his voice and if we don't allow Job to have his rage. I think that for a long time I really disliked the book. But I have come, after preaching on it in several cycles of the lectionary, have really come to love it, particularly when God shows up. So, yeah, so I think it is about that question of why do bad things happen to good people, and in that particularly Jewish way, which I think is so brilliant, of the understanding of having a God to whom one can complain, with whom one can wrestle, in a sense with impunity, is such a gift. So it's not just the question of what they call theodicy, right, the problem of evil, but it is also an invitation to throw the questions at God, that you don't just have to give in. And I think it's a gift. It's a real gift.
It was like a mic drop moment. Well, no, I think that is a way that I had never heard Job talked about. So I appreciated that, of having it be this idea of having sort of like a God that we can be angry with, because I think that is one of the gifts that the Episcopal Church gives us with our sort of denomination, is being able to question and be angry in a way that isn't like sacrilegious or it invites us to those questions.
And I want to be really clear. I think that is something we get from the Jewish roots of our tradition. Um, it's very precious. We see it. I think we see it even in Jesus. You know, the Garden of Gethsemane, and him weeping at the tomb of Lazarus, and overturning the tables in the temple. There is, yeah, those roots of being able to push back on God. It's all through the Psalms, you know.
Yeah, it is. It is definitely.
Yeah.
So we talked a little bit about Job's anger as to why this is happening to him. And I have always been interested in the friends' reaction and sort of their part in this story, because I find them really fascinating because they react how I feel like a normal person would in that situation and in that context of what was happening, in that something bad is happening to you, so you must have done something sort of idea.
Yep.
And I feel like that is a part of our culture now in so many ways.
Oh yeah.
Like,
well, the thing that flashes in my head is I think about on social media and folks that I know who are dealing with some kind of chronic illness or disability. Sometimes they'll post and they'll say, I need to say this thing about what I wrestle with. Please, no advice on, you know, alternative medicine, and have you tried this? And there's this, it's almost you know, the Facebook version of Job's friends of, well, if you're sick, here, let me tell you how to fix it. You know, that you must not have done enough. You must be lacking in knowledge. You must not have consulted with the right experts. And a lot of people with chronic illness are like, do not come at me with that. I'm the one who has to live with this. Yeah, I was doing some thinking about this today and looked at an article that a biblical scholar I really respect from Mexico. Her name's Elsa Thomas. She wrote an article about Job, and she starts out by saying that Job's friends start out right. When they first come to him, they just sit with him in silence for 7 days. They're just silent. Now, it could be that they were in so much shock that they didn't know what to say, which is how most of us are, how I am, you know, when confronted with Job-like tragedies in people that I care for. So they were fine at first. They just sat with him in silence because there was nothing to say. And then they had to start talking. And I think so much of when we talk unhelpfully with someone who is suffering, it comes out of our own fear of a universe that doesn't make sense. You know, so when the desire to say, or the impulse to say, you must have done something wrong, or you haven't seen the right doctor, or whatever, it's our way of trying to feel more in control of our own lives. Because when we see someone suffering, we know that could happen to me. And so by making it their fault with the illusion that I have been doing everything right, again in quotes, I have the illusion that I'm going to be okay. You know, that this isn't going to happen to me. I think it is one of the hardest things to learn and requires, I think, a kind of emotional and spiritual maturity, which I sometimes approach, but not always consistently, to be able to sit and acknowledge the depths of someone's pain and let that be. Just say, I see you. I feel your pain. And then stop. Just stop. Don't say anymore. Because I think so often and I think part of Job's frustration with his friends is, and this is modern language that I don't know that he would have recognized, but he doesn't feel seen. He doesn't feel heard. He keeps saying, I keep telling you, I did nothing wrong. I have not deserved this.
I feel like I personally have a sympathy for them, because I feel like in a lot of that same type of situation, I am like a fixer. So when I am with my friends, I also want to help them figure out, okay, how can we move forward from this? I'm like a big believer in like, okay, there's a certain part of whining and ranting and like you need to like have to sit, but then sort of like that moving on moment. And they say it too. It's the one thing I put a post-it note on before this. And they say, when will you end these speeches? Be sensible and then we can talk. And I feel like I have said that to someone. It's chapter 18. If you're like at home looking through your Bible,
Yeah,
it's chapter 18. Because they start, when will you end these speeches? Be sensible and then we can talk. Why are we regarded as cattle and you considered stupid in your sight? You who tear yourself to pieces in your anger, is the earth to be abandoned for your sake, or must the rocks be moved from their place? And I feel like that's interesting.
Oh, yeah. No, there's something, I think that is an important point. There's something there about what appeared in my head was a kind of chasm, right? That when someone is deep in suffering, they've kind of moved to another land, right? They don't live in the same place that we do. And it, in some ways, the boundaries of their world often closes in because either their emotional pain or their physical pain, whatever's going on, there is a kind of limiting quality to suffering where I can only reach so far out, right? And I think you make a good point in that there may be moments where there's a point of discernment of saying, I need you to build a bridge to the world that the rest of us are in right now, so that you have a chance to move off your island. And this is the trick, because the person who's suffering needs to have a sense of agency, because part of the point of suffering is you've lost a kind of agency, right? Something has been imposed on you that you did not choose, and you cannot choose not to have it. And so I think there's a balancing act between accompanying someone in suffering and the person who's suffering to say, we want to remind you that there's a bigger world out here that we hope you'll be able to join us in. And the person who's suffering saying, I need to be here and I need you to hear me from where I am. And I think there can be a kind of dance. I think about Parker Palmer has written some really beautiful stuff about depression and what it's like to be deep in depression. And one of the things he'll talk about is his Job-like friends, or the friends of Job-like friends, would come and say, oh, you'll feel better if you just go for a walk, right? Go outside, which is not an untrue thing, right? Even science will say, going outside, getting some sunshine can be helpful, but it wasn't the fix, right? He tells a story of a friend of his who would just come once a week and wash his feet. Literally would wash his feet and massage them. Didn't talk to him, just would do that. And that feels like that was that moment of building a bridge kind of with Palmer's consent out to the outside world that he could then build on as he was able. But there's no map for this. There are no set rules for when do you say to someone, just get up off your butt, let's just go for a walk, let's just get out of here, right? Or you need to make a decision, or you need to do a thing, right? Because sometimes that needs to happen. I've had people do that for me. And honoring where the suffering person is, you have to improvise it, you have to act in love, you have to go with a very, very gentle touch, and kind of exquisite instincts to where to go. Yeah.
I'm going to ask you a question, and you can choose not to answer it because I also don't know the answer. But I wonder if Job's friends, because what you're sort of talking about error, because you need to follow the person, but you don't know what's going to help them get out of this funk. And I wonder if Job's friends weren't given the chance to have that trial and error, sort of, because they did the right thing. They did those like 7 days in the beginning of being quiet. So is it also sort of them trying to figure out what would work to get Job out? Or is it that when they realized that Job was never going to be the same Job again, that they then sort of gave up and wrote him off?
I don't know the answer to that, other than the answer that the book gives. And the book of Job says they didn't get it right.
They didn't get it right. True.
So, sort of, although the book has them talking at length for a reason, right? Which gets to that bit at the end that I think is so, so important. So the last bit, and this was I got my attention drawn to this today. Let me find the citation. So Tom has, when she's talking about what happens with Job in the book, she talks about Job's ability not just to argue with God, but to maintain his dignity. And she cited his last speech before God appears in the book. And this is chapter 31, about verse 35. He says, "Oh, that I had one to hear me. Here is my signature. Let the Almighty answer me. Oh, that I had the indictment written by my adversary." So he wants to know like what the accusations are against him. "Surely I would carry it on my shoulder. I would bind it on me like a crown. I would give him an account of all my steps. Like a prince, I would approach him." I mean, he is saying, I can hold myself tall even if I'm carrying these accusations, right? There's a kind of dignity he carries. And these are his last words before God appears. So then God shows up in this whirlwind. And then God starts talking at length. I can't remember how many chapters we get to hear God, but it's several chapters of
It's like 2 full ones.
Yeah, like
38 to the end.
Yeah.
Which is to 42.
And so it sounds harsh, but God shows up and says, basically, you're God and I'm God and you're not, right? Where were you when I made all the things? Where were you when I figured out how the wild animals work? Where were you when the mountains were made? You weren't there. I was. Which seems harsh, right? At first. And so God goes on saying, I'm God, you're not. And Job's reaction is really striking. But those words were the words of Job just before, his last words before God shows up. So, I mean, and the images in what God says are just beautiful, about all of the things of nature. Yeah, it's just amazing stuff. And so after all of that, Job's answer is, I know that you can do all things and no purpose of yours can be thwarted. Who is this that hides counsel without knowledge? Therefore, I have uttered what I did not understand, things too wonderful for me, which I did not know. And then there's this tricky line, which is tricky to translate from what I understand. He says, therefore I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes, which at first sounds like Job saying, oh, I'm sorry, this is, you get to do whatever you want to me, God, and I shouldn't have complained. And I don't think that's what's happening. I think what has happened is that Job, in a way that you can never predict or control or even ask for, but it happens in the midst of his suffering and in the midst of his wrestling with God. God has opened up his vision in a kind of transcendent way. It's reminding me, there's a song that I just heard that has moved me a lot, called it's by the what's their name, the Bengsons. They got big at the beginning of the pandemic with a thing called the Keep Going song, which just was marvelous. The Bengsons. They just put out a song called My Joy is Heavy, which is a response to a lot of tragedy that happened over the course of the last year in their lives. And I think that it kind of reflects what's happening with Job, that in the midst of his suffering and in the midst of the wrestling with God, God opens up this connection with God that is transcendent, right? And there are no words, and Job kind of understands himself in the context of everything, and using language that we hear throughout religious traditions, that when people come face to face with the profoundly holy, you'll hear language like, I'm not worthy. And it's not a way of saying, I think I'm a horrible piece of mud. It's, I understand myself in context. I understand who I am in the midst of the enormity of the universe. And I feel small, but that's not necessarily a bad thing.
Can I ask you a question that also might be completely wrong, and you can shut it down? Is this where we get you are dust, and to dust you shall return for Ash Wednesday from? That's a hard one.
Oh, I feel like this is an ordination exam question.
So sorry.
So I don't want to embarrass myself. Well, in part of it, no. In part of that the I think it mostly comes from Genesis, from the creation story of Adam being created from the dust. And I believe, okay, I'm going to look this up because it's going to bug me. I am pretty sure it might be part of the curse when they are cast out of the garden. Yep. No, actually, you are dust, and to dust you shall return is when Adam and Eve are cast out of the Garden of Eden, and they're going to experience death. So God says, by the sweat of your face you shall eat bread until you return to the ground, for out of it you were taken, you are dust, and to dust you shall return. But there is an instinct there. I mean, literally the root word of humility is humus, dirt. It's about not dirt as worthless, but being really grounded and having a very true and honest sense of who you are in the midst of everything. And I think what we see in Job in that moment, and what I think, since we're in Lent, what we have to deal with, or what we are invited to do in the midst of Lent, is to do that, is to open ourselves up to God and say, show me who I am. And I am, a beloved and delightful child of God, that who God delights in, right? And I am flawed and frail and sinful, And sometimes I really muck things up.
Hmm.
And I'm not the most important person in the world, except when I am, right? So I think in the moment of this amazing confrontation between God and Job, this sense of repentance is not about Job saying, "Oh, you're right, I screwed up." It's about Job saying, "Okay, I see who I am." It doesn't answer the question of suffering. And I think part of the point of this exchange between God and Job is that this is not a question that can be answered. There's a kind of absurdity to the existence of the question that means that there is no answer. Any answer that would logically make sense to that question, I think shows up the absurdity of the question in the first place. If you posit a good God, the question cannot be answered straightforwardly. And so I think what the brilliance of the author of Job is to say, there is no answer. The only answer is a response from God and from me to God. And part of the reason I feel so sure, pretty sure about this, is that right after this, it sounds like God has been yelling at Job and that Job has repented for doing something wrong. But then God turns to the friends and says, Job got it right. And the friends have to repent. Which then gets to the other piece of the book of Job that haunts me and that doesn't get talked about a lot. And that's Job's wife, who is not named. She's often caricatured in a way at the beginning, almost in a kind of shrewish way, where, all of this horrible stuff happens. And she says, why don't you just curse God so you can die? And there are two things that strike me about that. A, it could be that that's actually, she's trying to offer him a way out of his suffering, right? It might have been a kindness. It was too hard for her to see him suffer. And B, she might not have been covered in boils, but she also lost all of her children. She also lost all of her livelihood. And I'm not sure where she is in this whole book. I suspect she's making sure all of these people get fed for the, 2 weeks that they're all sitting there in the ashes, right? It doesn't say that the friends sitting with Job for a week were fasting. Someone had to feed him. So what was Job's wife doing through all of this? She doesn't appear again, except she's implied. So you were talking, when we were first talking, you talked about how at the end where he gets all his stuff back and he gets more kids and it's all fine, which we all know it's not.
No.
Replacement kids are not a thing. They're just not. However, in order for Job to have those 10 children again, he wasn't going to do it alone. It meant that his wife had to be willing to be intimate with him at least 10 more times. And in discovering that she's pregnant, choosing to keep the pregnancy, because there have always been ways of ending pregnancies. She had to be willing to live with the risk of losing the pregnancy because miscarriages happen. She had to be willing to live with the risk of dying in childbirth. And she had to be willing to live with the risk of losing the child after it was born, because infant mortality is a thing, particularly in the Bronze Age. So there is someone behind Job and next to Job in this story. I want that movie. I want that graphic novel, right?
Yeah.
Because there is something about Job's wife's faithfulness in all of this. That's the authors, who almost certainly were men, because men wouldn't write about replacement children in that, because women would not write about replacement children in that way.
Mm-hmm.
Where there's a whole other piece of what it means to suffer, a whole other story that isn't told in that book, and is implied in the fact that Job and his friends could have that whole debate. That's implied in what God gives to restore Job at the end can't be done without his wife.
Mm.
And, I haven't thought through it too much, but it seems to me that there is something there about our own Christians about suffering, of the fact that we can't do this alone. Even Job and his unhelpful friends, he doesn't do it alone. He doesn't do it without his wife. There is some tradition that this might be a second wife. There's the text doesn't tell us either way, but I have no reason to believe this is not the same wife from the beginning. But what it means to move on, to maybe, to use that metaphor of the island, right? To move off your island with your suffering, to whatever the new life is beyond it, right? You are bringing your suffering with you. The grief that Job and his wife carry from the losses they sustain don't go away, but they make the choice to move forward with their lives, carrying that with them. But it's not done alone. They're together. And I think there's something really profound about that. And maybe even profound about the fact that it's not commented on, because that's just what you do with people you love, right?
Yeah.
You walk with them, you stay with them, you make sure people have enough to eat, you continue to express affection and intimacy with each other, you continue to make plans for your future, even though you know better than anybody at that point what the risks are, right? That last bit to me is a testament to that tenacity of humans to move on, even when we know what we're risking.
So would you say the person who got it the most right was Job's wife?
Maybe. I had not thought about it in exactly that way, but I'm inclined to agree with you.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting that for someone who's lost everything, God didn't take away the human connection. I think, not that I'm deciding what God was thinking or anything, but sort of the idea that would have been a step too far to take away the friends and the wife. Would that have then been the step too far to push? Because it is interesting that this man has lost everything except that. Yeah. No, I think there is something profound to that. And what does it mean even about the character of Satan, right? The adversary in this, that even he does not ask for that. Oh, the what ifs are intriguing. Yes. Oh my. Well, that will be lots of food for thought. Oh, I'm looking forward to the next time this comes around in the election year. I'm going to have so much more to do with it. Absolutely. Thank you. Well, I want to thank you so much for being with us today. If people want to connect with you and with the chaplaincy you have or campus ministry, is there a way for them to connect? I'm not great about social media. I'm getting better, but Brent House is on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter, in some version of Brent House or Brent House Chicago.
I can be reached directly at my email, which is Stacy Alan, STACYALAN at brenthouse.org.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being with us today.
This was so much fun, Ivy. Thank you. Thank you. I'm really glad you reached out. I'd be happy to do this again.
They live not only in ages past, there are hundreds of thousands still. The world is bright with the joyous saints who love to do Jesus' will. You can meet them in school or in lanes or at sea, in church or in trains or in shops or at tea. For the saints of God are just folk like me, and I mean to be one too.